Forward TV. The world is thinking.
Welcome to this session, Building the Future. I'd just like to introduce the platform, if I may. First of all, to introduce Tony McGuirk, who is the chairman of BDP. BDP are the sponsors for this session this afternoon. Tony is an architect and designer, and as I've said, sponsor of the session. Alistair Donald, on my left, is an urban designer and writer. And yesterday, some of you will know that Alastair and others launched a book on the future of community, and so he's here today. He's also pursuing a PhD looking at the whole question of mixed development. So, Alastair. And then on my far right, Steve McAdam. Steve is himself an architect and designer. He is a founding director of Fluid Design, who have done some great work in London, currently working on the Olympic project, and has got great experience of participation and engagement in architecture and design. And then finally, Richard Brown, who is an urban policy consultant. Richard worked with Ken Livingstone. He was recruited and established the Architecture and Urbanism unit at the GLA, and is currently again working on the Olympic project for the ODA in London. So that's our panel. The way this is going to work, I'm going to get each of the speakers to introduce their ideas to you for 5 minutes or so each. Then I'll open it up for some conversation between the panelists, and as quick as I can do, once we've got the ideas on the table, I'll open it up to you for challenge and debate. So that's how I plan to run it. And Tony is going to start us off this afternoon. So Tony, I'm in your hands.
Well, firstly, it's great to sponsor this particular session, so that's great. I was here last year. Very interesting. I want to talk about three things. One is consultation and where I sort of came into this originally, consultation. The second one is vision and what that really means, or visionary is. And the last one is really about people, about architects, designers working creatively with people. If I just start with the sort of, I noticed on one of the debates, which I think we're just about to miss, which is about the legacy of 1968. I entered School of Architecture in 1968, so this sort of fantastic idea of protest, creating participation in society, was sort of big deal to me and sort of a major sort of driving force. I mean, it was sort of an era when this sort of thing started, where modernism had come to a sort of full stop, and people started questioning it and putting forward different visions. Obviously, people at that time were interested in changing centralized visions, and also the sort of the corporations hand in those centralized visions, and did so in many ways. Also the date of the murder of Martin Luther King. So the interesting thing about that time was it brought a lot of people into view. The idea about modernism was it wasn't just for a certain sector of classes, it actually brought the whole of society into view, which was particularly for me very interesting. Can you hear me? Yeah? The second thing I'd like to speak about is vision. Vision has by its very nature single-mindedness, and it's almost intended not to work. You know, to be visionary is almost like it can't be practical. And that's an important thing to remember. So we have to, I think, discriminate between vision and just big projects or big achievements. So is Canary Wharf vision, or is it just a good piece of property development, a big achievement? Was Haussmann's vision for Paris really a vision, or just an interpretation of the sort of social structure of the day, creating new streets in Paris, breaking through the medieval city? But that had been done before, 6th or 5th centuries before. So was it really a vision, or just a practical way of dealing with society's needs? So then I come to Corbusier. Because Corbusier was really sort of like, I suppose, really the father of modernism. And Corbusier, when I entered sort of School of Architecture, and still is, was a great sort of inspiration to me, particularly in some of his works related to sort of, cubist spatial creation, form, material, and of course language. He really, I suppose, is one of the great creators of the modern architectural language. But this was that vision, or was that just expression? Well, I think probably, I mean, in my view, his greatest sort of work from an architect's point of view was some of his religious buildings, very strangely, for such a radical. But when he came to sort of planning and designing new towns, he was visionary. He created some horrific visions. He actually created for Paris the Plan Voisin, which literally sort of took out most of Paris, most of the historic structure of it, and all that went with it for the people, and created these great cruciform blocks that sort of stood in space, and it was wonderful. And of course, now we know what we got from it. The Ville Radieuse, etc., and the Plan Voisin was obviously mimicked. And the great problem with visions that don't work, of course, is the fact they are open to mimicry. And when they're mimicked badly, they're banal. So we got a world pretty full of banal visions which were based on Corbusian town planning, not necessarily as architecture, because some architects are good at some things and not good at others. It's a fact of life. And so we got this, and obviously we're still dealing with the problem, the legacy of it, and the people who are probably dealing with it most are probably not in this room. So this is what we've had, and we've had turmoil from it, and it's still in the streets of Paris and still in the streets of London and most other cities. But then there was a counter vision to this. And of course, this was about workability. And Team 10 came along and said, this doesn't work. And it doesn't really relate to people. There's no sensibility to place or to people. And, we're interested in real cities, not ideal cities. So this was a real tour de force for me. People like Giancarlo De Carlo, who said, architecture is far too important for architects. And people like Aldo van Eyck, who said, really, nobody's ever done this before. Modernism has been created and commissioned just like it was in the Renaissance. Patron-client commissioning, sort of architect with a style and a sort of a route to something. And of course, we also got people getting involved in this, like Jane Jacobs and Jan Gale. In 1968, Jane Jacobs had probably just about finished her book, Economy of Cities, which actually said to us, look, there's value in cities for people. Look at all these warehouses in these cities that people could use. Look at all these existing buildings. Orb's modernism hadn't taken account of anything like that. Being a person from the Merseyside area of the country, had we had Corb's vision, we would have had tower blocks where the Albert Dock now stands, designed by Richard Seifert and proposed by Harry Hyams, that famous London property developer. And that's what Liverpool would have got. Instead, Jane Jacobs inspired a group of people of that generation to say no, protest. They'd already got planning permission for it, but the protesters got it stopped. And my firm was one of those protesters. It played a formative part in that. And Liverpool has one of its greatest pieces of architecture, and probably more visionary than most of the stuff that actually would have gone in its place, because it was just banal mimicry of Corbusier. So, the counter-vision, was it more visionary? Well, it can't really be called vision because it worked. And that maybe is not a good idea to talk about in this thing, but I think working is important. And I have clients all the time who really enjoy creative ideas, but they want them to work because they've got them for a long time. So I do want to talk about then, not participation or consultation, because consultation smacks of legalese, it smacks of bureaucracy, form filling, doing things. So I want to talk about things like working creatively with people. And this is a real challenge for architects. It's really difficult, actually, because architects are brought up in their studios designing things. They get critique from professors, and they're all sort of part of the same thing, and it's good for them. But in actual fact, they become isolated from real issues and real people. Not every school, I have to say. Some schools have live projects, which is great. But the interesting things about working with people is it is actually quite liberating. Once you can get over that threshold of showing them your ideas, it's quite refreshing because they're interested in ideas. They're not dumbing down people. And the interesting thing also about this, Ralph Erskine once said that architects should be interested in architecture in its widest sense, because then they have a chance of changing the brief. And the interesting thing about working with people creatively is you do get a better chance to change the brief, because the rule makers that create all the problems in the brief, you know, the risk assessors, the security consultants, all these people, you know, environmental agency. In working with people, they start to see what is really important in the brief. So we have now a very important group of projects. I'm talking about society in Britain, of course society across the world. Propensity to have development and architect and design is significant. I'm sorry if I'm going on, but I'm not quite finished. But the interesting thing about that is this is a great opportunity for architects, no matter what anybody else says, and urban designers and designers, to work with the people who are going to use those projects. We have a whole schools programme which could really quite reform society for the better, where young people are going to go into new architecture, and they're going to either get some positive aspects out of it and become inspired by it and really want to sort of work with that and actually, you know, learn in it and then go on to better things, or they're not. So it's interesting that the more adventurous designs we do for things like schools and hospitals usually become the most successful ones, and they're usually the ones that are supported by the users. So the vertical schools idea that we've been doing for a number of years now, well, I mean, not that many, maybe 5 years, have been fantastically received by parents, teachers, pupils. Can you believe stacking primary schools 7 stories high with their own playground on every level? It's fantastic. They have a wonderful time. You know, they don't want to run around a playground, it's a big tarmac field. What's the fun? They have no chance of doing different activities. So these are very important aspects. It's really important that in the programs that we are going to go through, that architects that take this challenge seriously and work with people. Forget the vision idea. Just let's have some working with people to come up with really innovative, good solutions that work and work over generations, that people can use and reuse over the generations, and we don't have to scrap them all in 30 years' time. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Tony. Alistair, we're in your hands.
Okay. Can you hear me? You hear me? Yeah. Okay. Being at the conference yesterday, I think it was what became very clear was that one of the crucial themes that people were talking about is the importance of how we face up to times of crisis and deal with the kind of destructive period of capitalism. And I think it's very important that in a session like this we actually bear that fairly big question in mind, because one of the interesting things about the brief for the session, I think, when it talks about Houseman and Moses and people like that, and not actually their personalities, but Houseman's Paris and Moses' New York, is that we can really, I think, view them as a response to a time of crisis. I mean, you can see that actually even in very deeply problematic times, what we can see is that there's a springboard emerges as to the process of how you can reimagine the city, and how at times like that you can have a transformative effect on how cities can be built, both then and in the period that follows. And this kind of what Houseman and Moses represents for me, to be honest. It's not just a kind of a vision for a particular type of building or a vision for a particular type of neighbourhood or even motorway networks or whatever. It's actually that expression of something new and something different that came along at a time of huge problems in society. And if you think about what they achieved, I mean, Houseman didn't just build wide boulevards. He actually reconceived an entire city as a single entity. So, for example, he understood that you could redesign entire neighbourhoods and you could provide an infrastructure over an entire city that could actually take the way that you planned and thought about cities on from the way that people had in the past. And similarly with someone like Moses, he went even further. He saw that what the response that was needed at that particular time in response to the kind of the crash of 1929 and what followed was actually to be able to understand how to plan cities at a regional scale. So he actually moved the whole process of thinking about cities forward. And so I think we kind of got to ask the question really today, how do the ideas that we use to think about cities today stand up to that sort of challenge at a time when we actually need to start thinking radically and thinking different? And for me, there's kind of 2 points that come out very clearly. One is that what we seem to be faced with actually is a complete crisis of ideas in terms of the way that we think both about the future of society and more specifically about the future of the city. And the whole sort of community consultation process and community participation, if that's what you want to call it, and the kind of more state-led infrastructure type approaches really seem to me to have very little to offer actually, and they both accommodate to that fact of the lack of ideas and almost in a sense provide a cover for not being able to overcome some of the barriers that we face today. The second thing is that at such a time, how do we kind of move forward? Can we look to a kind of new singular figure like Moses or Houseman? Is that kind of Boris Johnson or Bernstein up in Manchester? And I think actually what you can see is that far from providing some sort of alternative model, that they actually epitomise many of the problems just now. So I just want to look at those 2 factors. Just firstly on the question of this kind of exhaustion of ideas and leadership. I mean, we're kind of used to hearing about things like Crossrail and airports mired in planning for years and years. But the thing is that actually even relatively simple projects to realise don't go anywhere very fast. You take something like the Thames Gateway Bridge, which I think the plans were already fairly complete for by about 2003, and it's been mired in consultation and planning procedures ever since, until a couple of months ago actually when Boris Johnson seemed to reject it. And kind of several things stand out for me about the Gateway Bridge that make it quite an interesting example, because if you look at the consultation process that was originally carried out, only 2% of people were actually against the bridge in the first place. Compare that to something like 79%, which were actually for it. And so the bridge, I don't think, was scuppered by any sort of democratic consultation process. The problem is that consultation processes are being used as a cover for the lack of vision to be able to realise projects like these. And kind of, if you look at how all these participation and consultation processes actually evolve and take place, then what you can see is that actually they're fundamentally undemocratic, because what you have is unelected community leaders, unelected lobby groups, unelected agencies and quangos who are all part of the consultation process and actually dictate what happens. So instead of the sort of democratic vision being pursued by political leadership, you have the scuppering of that vision by so-called democratic consultation processes. And it seems to me, anyway, fairly obvious that the planning authorities did actually want to build the bridge. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But they were unable to provide a sort of coherent justification, I think, for being able to do so. And they resorted to all sorts of things in the end, bizarre things like the bridge will provide for biodiversity and it'll spark kids' interest in engineering and all sorts of kind of things. Anything, it would seem, other than actually the fact that a 6-lane bridge over a river is going to provide for increased mobility. No one was prepared to actually argue for the bridge on that basis. And it got so bizarre at one point that you had this report here from GLA Economics, and you won't be able to see it, I'll read you the title. It's called Building Bridges, Some Lessons from the Middle Ages on the Long-Term Economic Impact of Bridges over the Thames. So what you have is an attempt to try and justify the building of a 21st century bridge by looking back to medieval times. And the whole thing is, the whole report is conducted through a framework of kind of the search for economic indicators to justify building a bridge, which involves searching through medieval tax records, and even kind of trying to find things like some sort of rationale in medieval bridge building for why women had a reasonable place at the table of construction. So it talks about the fact that they used to bring sandwiches for the men who were building the bridge as kind of some rationale for equality in medieval construction. So you can see that really the crisis of ideas about how we actually justify the building process today, I think, is manifest.
I was going to speed you up, Alistair, but then I was interested in your anecdote, so I'll let it run, but now you do need to speed up.
Okay, sorry. Okay, and in fact, the one, well, I've covered the fact that no one dared to argue for mobility as being a good thing, and so ultimately it's no surprise in the end when the public inquiry find that actually the bridge is going to be unenvironmental on the basis that there'll be too many crossings. So you have a bridge, for the first time I would imagine, turned down in history because too many people will cross it. Work that one out if you can. So I think that really the problem is actually the lack of an intellectual framework for being able to justify the future of cities and how we go about building them. And I would argue that as long as we're obsessed by the sort of more parochial, local ideas, environmental sustainability, all the things that actually tend to point the finger at human beings as part of the problem rather than part of the solutions for cities, then we'll kind of be mired in this kind of state of not being able to build anything. So just to tackle the second question very quickly.
You need to be very, very quick.
How do we address this inertia? Is it a new Boris, or is Boris the new Moses? Well, I mean, quite obviously not. For a start, he's much more ugly. But I mean, the thing about it is that Boris, in a sense, epitomises the set of problems that we've got today. That if you look at his latest strategy on planning for London, it is all about all the problems that I've just discussed. So he might talk occasionally about building an airport in the estuary as a way of getting things moving, but actually, if you look at his policies for public space, then they're fundamentally about clamping down on social order and introducing a much more authoritarian public space. And I think that, just to finish, the sort of the situation is epitomised for me by Dejan Sujic, actually, who recently wrote the book Endless City. And obviously is an occupier of key positions within organisations like the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment, and he's a director of the Design Museum. And what he said in a recent article to promote his book was that it's chastening but valuable to be confronted with how little you know. Now, this is a guy who's head of these organisations. He's got a long history. He's written 15 books or something, I think, and yet he can't conceive of how to actually go about realising future plans. And it was revealing that later in the same article, he basically came clean when he was talking about modernism. He suggested that theirs was a generation freed from the luxury of self-doubt. Ours is not, and that's why we struggle now when we try to think about what cities should be.
Okay, thanks, Alistair. Hey, Steve.
Okay.
With you.
Thank you very much. I think I'm all for visionary planning when it works and when we get it right, but sadly that seldom seems to be the case. We seem to make very large mistakes under the idea or banner of vision. I had some ideas that the name of this session should be shifted slightly away from the idea that we're talking about visionary planning and consultation to actually what we should be talking about is visionary consultation and planning in realising good pieces of urban design. Square the book a little bit more. I wanted to start off, though, with my own personal thoughts about three visionary projects and what's happened to them, and they're all cities. And the first of these is Chandigarh, the new capital in the Punjab that was built by a number of architects, but mostly Corbusier is associated with it in the 60s, in the 1960s. So what do we have here? What's visionary about this? He brought his tools of his trade and the signs of his architecture in the form of his famous brise-soleil, the sort of the shields that would cut out the sunlight, the sort of Venetian blinds that became architecture. But unfortunately, he got them in the wrong place, and he put them at the wrong angle because he hadn't understood that the sun path is different in this part of the world. so it does a splendid job of doing that wrong. It's a strikingly Western city when you're there, in the centre, in the capital itself. And further out, there's housing by Maxwell Fry, which looks as though it came out of an LCC catalogue for housing at the end of the 60s. So you find yourself there in this kind of cultural morass, not sure why it is that this ancient culture is using Western symbols and values to represent itself. What is there about that that's kind of visionary and appropriate to today's form of design? It's a form of colonization, of course, isn't it? So we could do better than that. The second is a city that was built at a similar kind of time, Brasilia. Here the ideas were really big economic ideas to stretch the economy inland from the seaboard by about 200, 300 kilometers, to open up sort of new woodlands and to build new forests, but also to try and give some sort of payback to the indigenous Indian culture. So at least in those terms, the idea, the hypothesis was enlightened and more up to date. Unfortunately, none of these things came to pass. The economy didn't grow. Huge tracts of land became sort of wasteland. The indigenous culture didn't really find much in the way of employment or enlightenment. And in fact, the kind of shanty towns that you see all clustered around the city of Brasilia are often used in manifestos to talk about what can go badly wrong with centralized planning. And the third of these, I wanted to actually go on and just say I had the pleasure actually of meeting the three main protagonists who were involved in making Brasilia. That was Lucio Costa, the planner, Oscar Niemeyer, the architect, and Roberto Burle Marx, about 15 years ago when I took some students across from the AA. And they were all delightful people, all very civilized, and they all lived in nearby Rio, of course. Lucio Costa, who was then about 90, fondly described some parts of Brasilia from his mind. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but there's a gigantic axis that goes down the middle. It's called the Green Sword, with the various embassy buildings assembled off it on either side. And he described these as lovely English lawns. He also described the Rodovario, the bus station, which is a kind of concrete bunker with sort of cloverleaf intersections and concrete highways above it and below it, as Piccadilly Circus. So it always struck me then, and still, that visionary planners live in their heads. And luckily, the third city wasn't built. This was to be even more radical, and it was at the hands of the Russian architect Leonidov, Magnitogorsk. He wanted to really start from first principles, and he started by asserting that the family was non-productive, bourgeois structure, out of date. We shouldn't be dealing with this any longer, but it knew kind of productive guilds and sects who would be housed in this magnificent city, a linear city with at its spine the sort of car dominating, and as you moved out, the architecture dissembled into the sort of landscape. There you would find the farmers and the craftspeople. In the centre you'd find the sort of industrial workers. This was a city where a car was to be king. A kind of curious thing is that Corbusier and this chap Leonidov seem to both have a love of ancient Egyptian planning. Corbusier's sketchbooks at the time of Chandigarh show endless sort of sketches of ancient cities like Memphis, whereas in Leonidov's case he put a gigantic pyramid in his visionary city. And there's a famous image from the time some of you may know of a gigantic dirigible anchored to this pyramid, just to show how modern and fresh his thinking was. So, I mean, for me, all of these projects are slightly mad. They're just faintly crazy. If you just stop and think for a moment about what you're trying to do, it would strike you that you're doing something that's not altogether right, or certainly not robust enough to carry on and invest all that money within. But everyone's had a go at it, from Tony Garnier to Frank Lloyd Wright, and it might just be that there's a crazy city in each of us that has to come out. What about the other side of the coin? What about dialogue and consultation? What kind of beautiful thing has ever been evolved by a committee? You'll all know the old chestnut about a camel being a donkey designed by committee. Well, I think here you can nominate all the most beautiful cities in the world, all of which have evolved piecemeal over time through countless forms of dialogue, negotiation, stress, reversals, political battles. This is a natural process. It's long been vaunted by Jane Jacobs. She's been mentioned before, and I'm sure you're all aware of her work. But central to her thinking was the idea that the most enjoyable of cities are those that have had this organic ability to grow and to change. They're multi-layered and have many, many strings to their bow, and they're not just one-trick cities like Detroit, underpinned mostly by car manufacturing, so that when the 70s came along, Detroit turned into an almost continuous ghetto where richer, deeper cities like San Francisco continued to thrive. Central planning very often goes for the one big idea, like car manufacturing centralization, and it's very often beset by problems later. So cities need the ability to change and to mutate and to shift, and I think planners have never been very good at this, especially the visionary ones, because they're shy to offer a vision that represents nothing more than change. It's a very difficult thing to try and sell. Another thing that's becoming more and more difficult, I think, for any kind of planner, let alone visionary planners, is that we can't find norms any longer to build on. We can't make assumptions about society and its tastes and its belief systems any longer. And without those norms, it's increasingly difficult for us to plan with any degree of certainty as to whether we're getting this thing right, whether our assumptions are right. And if that's the case, then you can't call that planning at all. It's just guesswork. So I think collaborative creativity is what's always shaped and will continue to shape the best of our cities. And I think we need to recognise that within that, what we need is the provision of a law-abiding, civilised, well-fed, nurtured populace. And for me, that's the real task of planning, to create city spaces, urban realms, where that can be provided, where people can be free to go about their business as they want. I think we've yet to see what a real intensively designed piece of contemporary city might be, something that had evolved through just purely a process of dialogue. I think it will happen. It may be that we run up against the problem that industry is such a remote thing for us, that supply chains and mass productions makes it very hard for us to think of design as bricolage or as a personal thing. But these things will change, and new kinds of designers, I think, will come about who can take those productive forces and use them in ways that we want, rather than ways that industry itself wants. I just want to finish on the point that other fields of endeavour have managed to do this beautifully. For instance, in passing, action painting, I think, has done this. Jazz music, open source design in the world of software, and lastly, flash mob as an ability to curate events. These are all examples of a collaborative process that makes something of quality and yet something to which we all intimately belong. So I'd like to leave it at that.
Okay, Richard Brown.
Thank you, Michael. I'd like to start just thinking of how London has been made, and I'm sorry for focusing on London, it's the city that I know. And it's commonplace perhaps to say that London isn't a city of big ideas, it's a jumble of different styles, different interventions. And that's true of many of the most successful districts. Nobody ever had a grand vision for Shoreditch as an arts centre, nobody had a grand vision for Spitalfields. Nobody had a grand vision for Bermondsey. And some of these popular districts are some of the areas which were shaped by the multiple small interventions rather than the big moves. But it is a city that has been subject to big ideas. We sit at the moment in, not strictly this building, but this area, in part of the legacy of the Great Exhibition. This is a city that created parks and docks out of marshland, that built an embankment to take sewage away from the river, and more recently it's a city that has built a new central business district at Canary Wharf and is now building for the Olympics. So the city is shaped by many grand ideas, many big ideas, and is also shaped by many of those that haven't happened. And many of these we can all feel thankful for. The ringways proposed in 1960s planning documents. I live in Brixton, and I cherish at home a lovely Brixton plan from the mid-70s, which shows everything apart from the town hall being demolished and replaced with nice concrete streets in the sky. Covent Garden, Coin Street. London is also shaped by the places where big ideas haven't been implemented, and generally, especially when one looks at what happened to other cities such as Birmingham, such as Coventry, we can feel thankful for the fact that many of those big ideas, big visions for London, were not realised. And so perhaps there is a healthy tension between the forces of wanting to bring forward these great big new ideas and what has been, since the 1960s and incidents like the Euston Arch, what has been an increasingly vocal community resistance movement to some big development ideas. I think that's true up to a point, but I think we're in a difficult situation now where discussion about community engagement, community participation. There is an enormous amount of rhetoric, but the reality is marked by bad faith and some woolly thinking. And I think what underpins this, I'll give some examples of what I mean in a moment, is what Alistair was referring to a certain extent, a failure in political nerve, wounded by the experiences of previous town planning exercises. It almost seems that the political class has given up trying to have big ideas and is simply moving from, I suppose, an ideologically driven mode of planning to one that's driven from a consumerist paradigm. Ask people what they want, let's do some market research. And I think that leaves a certain emptiness. There's a dialogue sometimes about nothing because there's a certain emptiness at its core. And the failure of nerve, I think, also underpins the reason why so many big projects, Crossrail, which is older than I am, Thames Gateway Bridge, these ideas that have been around for years and years and generations never quite get built. In relation to Thames Gateway Bridge, it's interesting to contrast it with the Docklands Light Railway, constructed in the early 80s. Now, the Docklands Light Railway was constructed and agreed in a few years by, if you remember, the evil anti-railway Conservative government. Whereas a Labour administration is still struggling to bring forward some of the major infrastructure projects in central London. So we have a model of community engagement which can, I think, border on the surreal at times, the types of discussions one has. I suppose about 5 years ago, when London was first talking about the Olympics, I was up at Clays Lane in the north of the Olympic site, a housing co-op and a travellers site, and I was talking to the people there about the plans, and we had big boards with lovely plans showing the new Riverside Park, showing the venues, showing the new housing. Everyone was saying, oh, these look very nice, until one woman, I think her name's Tracy Giles, and she was the spokesperson for the travellers living there, said, these are really nice, these plans, and really interesting, but why are you showing them to us? Because the whole point is we're going to be gone when these are built. I had one of those moments thinking, I think I've just walked through the looking glass here. So I think there is a level of humbug or bad faith about some community engagement at the moment. I think I'm going to pick on three aspects of this. One is about acknowledgement of the limits of community engagement and community empowerment. Cities change, all change displaces or inconveniences certain people. People cannot have a veto over change in their local area, and this is very difficult. I was talking to some friends on Friday night who were worried about a new development in Crystal Palace because we moved here because we wanted peace and quiet. We don't want new people here. That type of consultation, and they're responding to the planning consultation from the borough, doesn't incentivise people to say anything apart from no. It's just say no consultation, because you're not shown any benefit from welcoming change, you're only shown the disbenefits from these new people arriving in the area, clogging up the streets, adding to the waiting list for the schools. Too much community consultation and community engagement has tended to focus also, I think, on, and I am in danger here of getting shot by at least three architects, too much is focused on architecture and aesthetics. It's curious when one looks at the debates about places like Spitalfields, that where the debate was focused was on protecting some, not amazingly interesting in my view, market buildings, not on preserving the uses and the character of the place that lived within them. And what Spitalfields Market has been replaced by is basically a mall with some market buildings around the outside. What was interesting about that area has gone while the buildings were preserved. And similarly, what's the problem with Canary Wharf, if we think that Canary Wharf is a problem? It's not the architecture. It's not particularly appealing in my view, but the architecture isn't the problem. It's the way in which that development failed to have an impact, actually deliberately cut itself off from the communities living in that area. And the economic benefits and the social benefits did not flow out of that new central business district into the area. So focusing on appearances, focusing on saying no, not focusing on how the money is flowing, seems to me to sometimes distract community participation and community interest in new projects away from what really matters. Again, another anecdote from the Olympics. One of the most interesting organisations I came along through my involvement in the Olympics is London Citizens. They're an alliance of churches and trade unions and schools originally from East London, though they have branches across London. They came along, they didn't want to argue about what the stadium was going to look like or what the houses were going to be in the Olympic Village. They wanted to know how many local people we could guarantee would get work, how we could ensure that people working on the Olympic building site were paid the London living wage, which reflects the abnormal cost of living, what proportion of social housing was going to be available for local people. They came forward with very specific demands that focused on what the impact of this new development was going to be on the people living there, not on what the style of those buildings was going to be. So I think we're in a difficult situation. We've seen the errors of the past, we've seen the problems of the past. We don't want to repeat some of the visionary town planning that's blighted cities around the world. And we can see that through proper engagement with local people, one can actually avoid some of those errors. But at the same time, without the level of leadership, with a political class that seems more interested in a consumerist and ideological model of leadership, there is a type of vacuum at the heart of this debate, and perhaps we'll fill it in this afternoon.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard. Okay, what I'm going to do is, in the first instance, allow the panel to react to each other's ideas, and then I'm going to open it up to you. So just to kick that off and to ask Tony for thoughts on anything really that any of the others have said, and to ask you a question myself. I suppose I'm interested, Tony, in you make the point that that there was some great lessons learned in the reaction to modernism and that period in which we all became interested in engaging with people broadly in the design process. And there was that kind of moment really when lots of my generation certainly arrived on the scene, and we were incredibly sceptical about about what interventions would do to the quality of our lives. So we were disaffected. But I wonder really whether you think there's a kind of are we losing the baby with the bathwater, as it were? Is there something about the rejection of modernist thinking that is a problem for us? I wonder. But don't constrain yourself. Anything that you want to say in relation to anything?
Well, I think the answer to your question is no. I don't think there's anything that I personally, or many people, would want to keep about a lot of early modernism.
Use the mic.
Yeah, sorry. The answer to the question is no. There's nothing in the sort of first wave of modernism that's not been already given the dynamite treatment that one would really want to keep. Because it was sort of, it was almost like a different time. And one has to accept that it was like a different time. And architects were commissioned by centralized executives and corporations, just like in the Renaissance. They just went and they did their thing. Well, that's fine. And some of them are quite good. Mises' Seagram Tower is quite good, but it's not Jan Gales living between buildings. So I'm interested in people living between buildings. And it's separate, it's private. So the one thing that really took up in that period was the fact that they did interest commercial and autocratic people. So all the autocrats took modernism and just used it like a stencil across Europe, some parts of America, lots of parts of America, and lots of parts of Asia. So the answer to, I feel quite strongly that the answer is no. I think one of the great difficulties is the fact that that we want to keep more of it now. We did a bus station in Preston. It was quite interesting actually, and Jonathan Glancy wanted to keep it. We're going to knock it down. I think we should knock it down, because it just doesn't work as a bus station. It's cold, people hate it, it's sort of quite interesting in a brutalist way, but it's better knocked down. You could create a far better building. So I'm volunteering that we get rid of that. I would actually volunteer to get rid of a lot more that maybe the 20th society would like to keep. So the answer is definitely no. We're in a different time, and we should recognise we're in a different time. The interesting things about the modernists and the people that support that is the modernists that created it didn't want anything of the previous time. But now the modernists want to support that previous time. So I don't think they can have it the biscuit and the tin. I think they've got to sort of put up with how society is progressing. So I think it is important that society does progress, that what Giancarlo De Carlo called the messy vitality of life is given vent with architects, and architects really take the opportunity. I know, in actual fact, I didn't disagree with the idea about architects and aesthetics, there have been too much thinking about aesthetics. And there still is in the schools of architecture. We talk far too much about aesthetics. And it's interesting in the sense of, so we're doing quite a lot of work in Holland, that the Dutch are far more purposeful about how they do things. Maybe it's because they got water coming up to their ankles, so therefore they have to be purposeful, and something has to, you know, if you go to a Dutch client and say, what does this mean? And I think that's what you start with in architecture and urban design. What does this mean? What does it mean for the future?
Okay, thanks very much. Alistair, again, I mean, your opportunity to, you know, to pick up on any of the themes that have been raised by other people. But I suppose my question to you really is that, I mean, you've made the point about participation, or the government's construct side of participation and consultation. Indeed, others have kind of talked about the hollowness of the nature of lots of what passes for participation. But I just wonder whether you think that you know that there's a positive end, really. I mean, surely isn't it a good thing that urban designers, you know, want to engage with the real messy stuff of life in order to decide what is good development? So, you know, given that you're a kind of a critical voice in relation to much of there's great enthusiasm for collaboration these days. Patsy Healy's ideas really kind of set the tone for the planning framework today. You know, isn't there a positive side to that enthusiasm to engage with people? I wonder. But please, again, don't feel constrained. Kind of anything that you want to say.
Well, to some extent, I kind of didn't disagree with some of the things that Tony said about certainly. In order to design a project, obviously you need to become involved in it and to gather all the information and to meet all the different bodies that are going to be party to that particular process. So there's a practical reality of actually being able to do that. And certainly a former colleague that I used to work with swore by the fact that you could do a design charrette and actually cut through whole tiers of bureaucracy, and you could confront a lot of the backward ideas, the risk aversions and all the rest of it, as you say, by engaging in that sort of process. But I think you've got to kind of step back, and there's a broader issue here, and kind of what not too many people ask today is what are people actually participating in, and what are they achieving by participating in it? And it seems to me that actually, if you look at the kind of framework that's been set, then if you're designing, if you're developing a master plan for an area, then what is actually going to define at the end of the day what's in that master plan? Well, you've got 25 planning policies statements to deal with. You've got all the planning that surrounds transport and all the environmental justifications that you've got to carry out to actually get a project agreed in the end. And actually, broadly, that is what is going to determine what's in your master plan at the end of the day. So you're kind of drawing people in to this participatory planning process on the basis that they have a say about determining what an area is going to be like. And actually, what they're really deciding is what the name of the street's going to be based on some minor celebrity that used to live in the area 50 years ago. I mean, that is the kind of level of discussion that goes on at a lot of these participatory planning discussions. So there's kind of not a lot of input there, I don't think. But if I can just come back on a couple of other things, because I think, I mean, this idea that you kind of have Jane Jacobs, and she writes about the economies of cities, and then ever since then it's been that's been the model for the way that we need to think about master plans in an economic sense. And you think about New York, which she's often lauded for being someone with successful thoughts about how it should be designed. And the whole thing about New York is that actually it was only successful in the latter part of the 20th century and remained remains so today because of the thought and the ideas that went into the regional plan that was developed in the 1920s, which Moses actually did most to implement. And there was a very interesting debate in New York that sort of kicked off 4 or 5 years ago about actually a kind of reappraisal, I think, of Moses after the sort of the Robert Caro biography of the mid-70s, and a realization that actually is that sort of large-scale urban planning exercise that actually sets up the city to be successful. And you can have your sort of neighborhoods, and you can have permeable grids or whatever you want in them, but unless you have the broader ambitions to be able to design a city with that sort of aspiration to make it succeed, then you won't really achieve anything. And just one final point on the question of kind of big visions and big ideas. I mean, I think we shouldn't get too caught up in the idea that this is a kind of scale thing in cities. Actually, it's not. It can be a scale thing, but I think it's more about whether we can step outside the sort of limits that seem to hem us in just now in every aspect. And that doesn't just mean to say that can we design a whole city region. It means that can we have ambitions for a neighbourhood that actually realise that there's something a bit more to give than just the sort of very staid, sort of sustainable development type ideas that we're faced with just now.
Okay, thanks, Alistair. Steve, there's a clue in the name of your company, isn't there? Fluid design. And I mean, you've talked about the sort of the nature of change and, if you like, the appropriateness of an organic approach of understanding properly how places change in real life, and then engaging with that in your practice. So fluid design, and I just wonder then about your quip about there's a city in all of us. Given that kind of model of change. What does that do to the idea of being purposive? Do you think that we should stop trying to have big ideas and big plans? And kind of how do you square the circle with your concept for the reality of life, in the global world that we live in? And again, it's a bit like that kind of continuation of the thoughts in relation to modernism. Where does that leave us in relation to the grand design and the big idea and the big organising principles, a very confident, future-facing sense of the world?
Okay.
And then, of course, please, anything else that you want to draw on.
Okay, thanks. Well, I think we're talking about different scales of things here. I don't think consultation, which is a very poor word to describe some form of really creative dialogue, can solve all the problems, and no one should suggest that it does. I mean, infrastructure planning, I wouldn't expect someone to knock at my door and say, we're thinking of planning a station, sir, major station, where do you think we should put it? Certain decisions, certain large-scale infrastructural pieces of thinking and equipment need to be detailed by professionals who know what they're doing, and I'm a little scared even when I say that. How many people here actually trust transport planners nowadays? But we have to learn to trust some people to make those decisions. Inside those bigger frameworks, there are smaller and smaller ones. And when you come down to a more local level, a public kind of realm level, that's where you need to talk to people. It's not just about consultation. Do you like this idea, sir? Would you prefer green? It's about how they've lived in a place, about their cultural experiences of that place, the landscape as they understand it, and about us as designers locking into that, extruding from that if we can. I think the modern movement was the first time there was a complete fracture with a kind of everyday culture, a set of shared ideas and ideals that most people, even if they were not educated, would know implicitly and experience every day of their lives. The modern movement changed all that, turned it into an abstract set of notions that was not widely owned, and which could be patrolled only by the professional spectrum. In my view, it was a kind of shame that sort of split happened, and I think we have moved beyond it. It's not to say it didn't have some good ideas. I think it had some very virile thoughts about how we had to handle problems of the future. And maybe just at the point it was beginning to mature into something else, it stopped. It sort of ran out of steam. It ran out of grand sort of masters. What else could I say? This idea that we move to a system where we rely totally on political vision and totally on professionals to get it right is, for me, extremely scary. Why did Mitterrand want to build large opera houses or parks or libraries? 2 of the 3 not working today very well in Paris, and the 3rd only working because a later housing project was developed by Chirac, the later mayor. Those were his big sort of tombs, monuments to himself, if you like. Nobody particularly wanted them. I don't think they did anything to help Paris at all, in fact. So I don't see that as political leadership. The problem is that many politicians imagine the way that they make their way in the world and make themselves felt is by such ridiculous sort of grandiose gestures, you know. I'm all for a kind of political body that can work and can come up with ideas and not be afraid to express them. And I don't see consultation as being in any way adverse to that.
Okay, thanks. Richard, I mean, your thoughts on Robert Moses. I mean, given the kind of frustration that you express about the failure to deliver Crossrail, the difficulties with the Thames Gateway Bridge, and a kind of sense that British society in particular can't get it together and deliver big projects. Don't we need a Robert Moses for today? Perhaps the fact that that the Howard Bernstein in Manchester has got a keen eye for how power works and is extremely efficient at mobilising political support, resources, and executive decisions. That kind of organisational instincts and sense of power is a good thing today, surely. And so I just wonder about how you see Robert Moses and what he did in Manhattan, given that we're now, however many years it is after Jane Jacobs.
One's picture of Moses is always going to be informed heavily by Caro's monstrous, thousands of pages biography. Reading it is not so much a read as a hobby. And it's a compelling book because it has there's something suspect about it because it has this narrative arc of a Greek tragedy of hubris and nemesis and fatal flaws in characters. And Moses was clearly, in some ways, very admirable, both as a strategist and a tactician. I think as someone who's worked in the public sector and has felt frustrated about getting things done, his tactics of starting the project with the £1 million investment, then going back to Albany or back to City Hall or back to Washington saying, well, I've started now, you can't stop the project now, I need another 10 million, I need another 20 million. And that duplicitousness, for want of a better word, did manage to achieve an incredible level of investment into New York from the 20s onwards. He was also a man, I think, who started off with a vision for social equity. The fights he had with the robber barons on Long Island in putting the parkways through there so that ordinary working people from Manhattan could get out and enjoy the countryside were, I think, progressive battles. And when they got there, they found facilities that had been designed to a quality that people did not generally design facilities for the general populace. So there's a lot to admire. It needs to be said, however, he was clearly a racist thug. And one can't avoid those aspects of his character. The facilities, he actively discouraged black and minority ethnic people from using the facilities. His Hudson River Parkway, as soon as it got up to 125th Street, all the nice finishes, all the quality of design disappeared. And the way he treated even his more principled opponents, people who just expressed mild concern that perhaps his idea was not always the best one, was vicious and vindictive. So a complex character, and I think the question maybe is whether one could imagine a person with some of his positive characteristics who do not have some of the frankly despicable character aspects that he had.
Okay.
That's what I thought.
Very good.
All right, so it's over to you. Any questions or comments at all? And I'll try and get the panel to make some brief comments as we go through, but I'll mostly ask you to save our feedback until the end to give you the maximum time possible. So, gentleman standing at the back.
Thank you. One of the things about modernism, or one of the things that makes modernism revolutionary, is that it's in part an aesthetic of the cheap. It's about applying cheap techniques to achieve the same result. or ideally to be able to get the same bang for to get more bang for the same amount of buck. The flip side of that is, of course, to bring money into this, is that when buildings get cheap, land becomes expensive, and when you have when buildings get cheap and land gets ever more valuable, and once high architecture has allowed the aesthetic of the machine into urban life, then then less sophisticated uses of that aesthetic then can lead to very cheap and very bad buildings indeed. And there's been an enormous amount of very bad, very cheap building which has had dramatic and deleterious effects on communities around the world. That being the case, it seems to me that it's hardly surprising that when people engage with, certainly when non-specialists engage with the planning system, that their concern about the aesthetic characteristics of the buildings that are being proposed is entirely justifiable and potentially even wise, given what has been foisted upon people in the past. I just wanted to make one other point, which is that part of the problem with the planning system, and it's a system that to some extent I work in, is that consultation processes tend to ask very much if questions rather than how questions. That's to say, it's much easier to ask the question, should we build here where there is currently open space or underused space, rather than positing the questions of different levels of density. And so you get these strange proxies appearing in the planning system where people who live in villages regard densities of 35 to 50 dwellings per hectare as an appropriate rural density, despite the fact that the 18th century core of the village, whose character they're trying to protect, consists of small terraced houses bunched together at densities approximating to over 100.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop you there so we get more people in. There's a gentleman at the front here. Yes?
Hi, I'm not an architect. My brother is, and I have friends in the architecture world. So I don't understand all of your training, but I understand aspects of it. I'm actually a trained industrial designer, but I practice a lot of user-centered design in my work as a software user experience architect, and I understand that I could potentially be sued for having such a title. But I think what's interesting is with your talks around consultation and potentially participation in the design process, that's something that we push so much, because so much of what we do is all about interactions and experiences of a piece of software, say. So I would say to you, there's a lot you could start learning after we've learned so much from you guys around involving users, people in the process. I think in several ways, formative in the way to understand people's behaviour in the current environment and understand maybe their self-reported aspirations and attitudes to their environment, etc., and what their ambitions are for this environment. But also to kind of work with them to create prototypes, create environments together, which there's still an aspect that you still need the ego of a designer or an architect, the visionary in some ways, to push the ideas out there. But then you can then evaluate those ideas and somehow put those into practice in some way. And I think maybe that's the hardest thing for you guys, because we can just develop a bit of software and prototype it, and then we can test it. But you guys can't exactly build a whole city and then test that out. But maybe there's a challenge there to kind of work through. And I think just following that, the kind of principles again of user-centered design is to kind of evaluate the thing once it's there and to measure it over time so you can iterate and evolve it. So it's not just a kind of completely organic growth, you can just measure it. And I think, I'll go back to kind of maybe what I have learned from architecture and the kind of the thinkings of maybe Christopher Alexander, and notes on the synthesis of Thorne and how buildings evolve over time and by people changing them and stuff. So look towards user-centered design. I think it's maybe quite an interesting angle. I'd be interested to know if any of you guys have looked into that kind of practice.
Okay, thank you very much. Lady on the far right over here.
I think previous speaker, I think we have a lot in common. I was sort of listening to the panel and someone mentioned flash mobs and jazz as this sort of really nice, organic, we all build it together thing, but they're highly authored events by someone with a vision that goes, we want to do something like this, and I'm opening it up to a sort of open sourciness. And I do think, I find it really, again, like you, I'm not an architect or an urban designer, but I find the sort of reticence to talk about visionaries and visionaries being something quite bad. I find that difficult because it does feel that one needs to author and then look at what that vision does. When I was listening, it seemed to me that there's two expertises. There's the expertise of the visionary, the designer, the architect, about what they want to achieve, what they think will be a progression in their field. And then there's the user expert. I live here, I know what my roots are, I know how I use the space, and I know what's currently wrong and what the ambition of this space could be. If that can feed into the vision, that would be good, which leads sort of to the consultation process. What sounds wrong with it is the expectation of democracy, which shouldn't be there. It should be about, we are consulting about what you know about, and we really want to incorporate that in what we build so we can build a better thing for you and for others, rather than, why don't you tell us what you want? I think that sets up an expectancy that can't ever be realised in a great way.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, at the back, Penny?
There's a famous saying, I'm probably misquoting it really for Tony, which is to blame Le Corbusier for the failures of British social housing is like blaming Mozart for Muzak. And I think that's something that we should bear in mind, given that there is a discussion on Le Corbusier at the moment. I want to just say a little bit about Corb. I suppose what he was doing in the 1920s with his vision for Paris, and then in the 1930s with the Villa Radieux, was he was trying to throw into the public sphere ideas about how we could imagine the city of the future. And I think that was a very commendable and brave task, and he was quite an arrogant individual, but I think he did that at a time when there was probably a resistance to do that. And whatever anybody else says about, we liked Corb's villas, but we hated his ideas for the modern planning regime, I actually feel the other way around. I love his villas, but I think that he made a very valuable contribution to the question of the city in an environment in which you had industrialization, issues of mass housing, and most importantly, transport. And I think that we still have not really engaged properly with the question that he engaged with, which is, how do you build the city in relation to the car? All we've done in the last 20 years is say, let's ban the car. We really haven't got to grips with that question, and it is a question that designers should feel that they are in the tradition of Corb in trying to solve that problem. One of the things that he says in, I think it's in Towards a New Architecture, is that you can look at the way that a man behaves and a donkey behaves. And if you look at a donkey on a street, it will sort of meander and it will walk to where there's shade, and then it might turn around a bit and it might come back and it might move around. There's no pattern to the way that a donkey moves around in a street. If you look at a man has purpose, and he will move directly from point A to B. It's a very useful metaphor for the difference between us and animals, I think. And basically what he was trying to say is we need to organise our cities to meet our needs in a modern society. And I think now we've got the donkey vision of what the city is. It's just all these purposeless people meandering around. So I'd really mainly like Tony, but some of the other people to come back on that. Can I just do one very short point? One sentence to Steve. If Chandigarh is an expression of colonialism, I live in Scotland and we've got lots of social housing that looks like it came from Stuttgart and Berlin in the 1920s. Was that colonialism as well, or was that just international sharing of ideas?
Great. Okay, there's a gentleman over here, and then I'll ask you to respond to anything that you'd like to, then I'll bring some more people in.
Nico MacDonald. I used to work on Blueprint magazine, but I'm not an architect. I was interested, this is to Steve, and I'm interested that some of the themes he brought up have been touched on by two of the earlier questioners. He talked about flash mobs and open source design as inspirations for new models of architecture, or at least parallels to. Flash mobs, I'd observe, only exist in the books of Clay Shirky, who I greatly admire, but they never actually take place. Open source design is interesting. So open source as a software development model works. Open source design is something I maybe working with Royal College Industrial Design or Innovation Design Engineering on shortly, but I haven't seen any examples of it. And I would observe that in the open source rhetoric or examples, the people collaborating are themselves experts. They're software developers who collaborate around software development, not around innovation, interestingly. All open source projects, apart from arguably the web server, mimic existing things. Linux mimicked the Unix operating system. OpenOffice mimics Microsoft's great work on Office. There's no innovation there. There's replication. There's better quality. But I wouldn't posit that as a method for going forward. And I think we actually need to... I mean, I think what you might have been referring to, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, is co-creation, a very popular term in design, not necessarily in architecture, or open innovation, where you take ideas from the community, from expert lead users, and try and incorporate them into your process. That requires leadership. It does require people having a view. It does require expertise. It requires having a vision. And there's a nice phrase from the software, well, from the usability world, really, that you can't sand a table into a chair. You may take views from people about things, but without expertise, without knowledge, without a sense of a bigger vision, it's very difficult to get people to think like professionals do, which is think laterally, think ambitiously, go around the problem rather than head straight for it, which is the typical way we do things, but not the way that designers work. And I think we need to celebrate that aspect of design. And there is actually a question in this. Who watched Kevin McLeod's Big Town Plan, produced by my friend David Barry? I'd be interested in people's responses to that, the 4 examples of varying success of consulting with the community about design.
Okay, I'm going to ask the panel for anybody that wants to respond to anything that people have said. Then there are lots of other people. I think I've got most of you, but I'll ask you again to indicate in a second. But perhaps to move down this way. So Steve, to start off with.
Well, the first thing about the modern movement, I think yes. I mean, there was some very strong ideals at the time. I remember as a student reading them and thinking, marvelous, what great thinking, the machine aesthetic, the repetition of things, the sort of structures which are used to derive and store knowledge. All of these things made sense. All of these things seemed to gel with what we were living through at that time. But since then, I think there's been a radical shift away from all of these recognizable routines, these repetitive kind of processes, into something that seems to be much softer, much harder to grasp, whether it's the productive machine itself that can be with CNC machines produce practically anything that you choose to do, still economically, to forms of knowledge which seem to blur. In the university I've been associated with, there are new ME courses coming out practically by the week that seem to blur disciplinary knowledge, introduce new kind of hybrids for action and thinking. So I think this is the point at which modernism, for me at least, began to lose its purpose, began to lose its way, began to lose any model that was locked for me with a contemporary appreciation of society. I think you're right, though. It has been reappropriated many times very badly around the world. Unfortunately, there are good and bad architects. That's you can't really guard against that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Richard, anything at this point?
2 quick thoughts. I agree completely with the point made about if questions and how questions, and actually having that grown-up discussion about density and trade-offs with private gardens and trade-offs with open space and internal space standards. There are a lot of discussions that one can have that are more real than do you want these new houses and all these new people moving into the area, please say yes or no, which unfortunately is what the planning system tends to push people into. I'm not saying that's the full extent of how one can involve communities. The gent there made the point about prototyping, which I think is quite interesting, and we can push the software analogies probably too far. I can certainly push them too far since I don't know much about software, but it strikes me there have been prototypes. Something like Butler's Wharf in the area around Shad Thames, that was a prototype. The accepted model of development along the south bank of the Thames and the north bank of the Thames was to demolish old warehouses. It was only after Terence Conran said, well, can we actually use these differently, and establish that people would go and live in former warehouse buildings and set up restaurants, etc., that the whole development of Bermondsey and the whole world of using post-industrial buildings in that way came forward. So we can see successful prototypes. What unfortunately we see more of is where a prototype's been put forward, be it system-built housing, and has been seen to fail over generations.
Okay, Tony.
Thanks. A number of things, really. aesthetics on the cheap, I think, is very interesting because sort of I started my working life working on a council estate in Newcastle. Working on a council estate in Newcastle. I come from a council estate, and obviously we were always trying to get architecture out of what we had. You know, we didn't have a lot of money, so we were trying to make architecture or make things that sort of seemed that were useful to people, good spaces. The great difficulty with modernism, it did become aesthetics on the cheap, and people took advantage of it. You know, in the sense of Aalto was derided in Finland for a long time because the rationalists said, well, we just basically want houses, we just build them, they're this high, and we just roll them out. And he was asked the question, what is the cheapest house? And he just said quite simply, the deepest house. And it's true, and we still build deep houses, not necessarily just for cheap people, but also for quite expensive people. So working with economies is a sort of different thing, I think, for architecture. And of course, obviously, on the other hand, modernism actually created a lot of expensive projects, highly expensive projects. So we have this sort of, you know, two-sided sense to modernism. And this ties in, I think, to some of the things on Corbusier. I don't agree with you about Corbusier. Love Corbusier. My wife sat there in the second row 35 years ago when she was my girlfriend. We hitchhiked down to see Marseille, Ronchon, La Tourette. Wonderful stuff. Very inspiring. Very inspiring. In a cubist aesthetic sense. But what he did miss out was he did miss out the people. He just missed out this thought that people might have feelings. So there was no sensibility to the idea that people would have feelings when they got into a cheap room which was 15 meters deep and only had daylight from one side. So that's something that we have learned. Whether we've really actually taken it on, I'd say we haven't. Only some architects have taken it on. The thing about the prototype thing, I think is, you know, industrial designers, etc., working in certain ways is very interesting because one of the things architects don't do is they don't follow their buildings through. I imagine industrial designers sort of have their portfolio and follow it through almost like as a course of research. Now, we obviously put our buildings into books, but Jim Sterling said he never went back to a building after the first year he'd done it. And you can understand why, having seen Jim Sterling's buildings. So we never go back. And it's almost sort of not in the culture of architecture to go back and stay with a building. This is totally different in Denmark and Holland, by the way. They stay with their buildings over time. And you have to get some sort of dialogue with the architect to change it. And it's usually a pragmatic dialogue. It's not a sort of defensive one. So that aspect, I do think we have created cities for the car. I've never been to Detroit, but it looks pretty much car-born to me. And it is a car city. So the whole series of things.
Need to push you on, Tony,
yeah,
to
okay.
get one or two people in.
The other thing about architects, they're not experts. I think industrial designers are experts. I was sort of a member of a jury panel last year where it was for RIBA Awards, and one young architect had been doing this home for an industrial designer, and the industrial designer absolutely tortured him to death. Tortured him to death. Here was a generalist working for a specialist. And in actual fact, the specialist had drained the life out of the architecture. That's why a generalist has to do architecture. That's why a generalist needs to do urban design. It can't be a specialist.
Okay, thanks. Alastair, any quick thoughts?
Yeah, just on the big plan, because I saw 3 out of the 4, and I mean, it struck me as just completely indicative of many of the problems that we face today. And what was particularly striking, I thought, was the summing up that he made in the last programme seemed to bear absolutely no relationship to the 3.5 programmes before, which had been this chaotic process of trying to get things built. So you take, for example, the bridge that they started off with a budget of 120,000, which ended up a £3 million bridge. No brief, people chipping in ideas here, there, and everywhere, but without any really coherent sense of where it was going. And you could argue that it ended up a reasonable bridge, but it was more by miracle than any sort of real kind of objective design process. And similarly, the thing that struck me about the main things that the community seemed to be involved in were in the design of things like the furniture for the parks, which was kind of all about really trying to create spaces that modified people's behaviour in terms of how they use parks. It was very much driven by the whole idea that you could design out any sort of antisocial behaviour. And so what you had was a community hitched up to basically all of these backward ideas on the use of design to create new forms of social order. And when you got to the final programme and Kevin MacLeod summed up, he kind of recognised that the whole thing had been completely chaotic, and he pretty much said as much when he started summing up. But he concluded with the fact that at least they were involved, weren't they? And that seemed to be, for him and a lot of other people actually, the whole thing about community consultation was that it was the sense that somehow the community had been shoehorned into some sort of official process where they'd had their say on not very much as it happened, but they were involved, and that was what was important.
I was taken to Bristol last week to do a discussion with 4 artists on a new art, media and community centre which has just opened up, and mainly to talk about how we need to engage the community and not parachute in. And we were driven there by taxi for 2 hours and then brought home again. But it was interesting in as much as one of the questions was, we built this community centre and we haven't got a bus for the local people to get to the centre, a typical community question. And the answer from the artist next to me was, you need to engage an artist in developing a strategy to approach the local authority best to get your message across. My suggestion was to go to the council and say, give us a bloody bus, to which he said, yes, sorry, you need to engage a graphic artist to design the slogans. And it's that idea that actually, you know, there's an undermining of the very thing they're trying to create. The notion that people now cannot really be allowed to or seen to, or even, you know, you can even think that people could actually organise on their own to organise something as basic as a transport connection to the very community centre which the local authority has funded, without then some third-party interventionist coming in and saying, actually, I have to moderate and mediate that on your behalf. Undermines that whole notion of this being a community centre to allow people to express themselves, you know, in the first place. And I think that's part of the problem which comes up to this kind of tiers of visionaries discussion. You know, the czars are everywhere, whether it's town mayors or whatever it might be. Vision is a social phenomenon, and we're making out that it's an individual genius which can actually have this kind of light. And unfortunately what we've done is we've lost nerve on both sides. And we've lost the nerve to make the decision. We've lost the nerve to allow people to make bad decisions. And I think that there's a defensiveness within this entire discussion. I mean, I've enjoyed it, but it's been partly reflective in some of the comments. There's a desperation, I suppose, for legitimacy as a role, and we can't legitimize ourselves through architecture because nobody ever does that anymore because we've lost our confidence. Therefore, we have to do it through social policy networks, and I think Alastair made a point about how we justify everything in terms of obesity targets or whatever it might be. And I think that is the key here. Just as you may not like Corbusier, but actually he dared to succeed, he may have failed, but even failing actually is a good visionary perspective and a good dynamic. I think that if we lose that defensiveness and take control of it ourselves, then we've got something to fight for.
Okay, that was Austin Williams from Future Cities Project, which also sponsored the event today. Just 2 really quick points, the lady here, and then I'm going to bring the panel back in for final comments. Just really quickly now.
Yeah, I'm interested in the tension between the expert and the ordinary person. I'm not an architect either. I'm married to one, so which is not that brilliant because he drew the pictures of our ideal house and then he got bored. But what he did do is he gave me a kitchen. I said I want my work surfaces this high, and I want it to be really nice, and he did the rest because I am not an expert. And I am not also particularly interested in where the zebra crossing is. I'm not particularly interested. I just want there to be one where it works. So I'm interested in where people come in the consultation process. And it appears to me that this chap is saying that people, sorry, blue t-shirt man, is talking about consultation right at the early stages, employment. basic amenities and so forth. And the
have
problem,
to be
and the
quick.
problem, sorry, and the problems that have been raised about consultation are all to do with how it doesn't work. What I'm at the later stage, what I'm asking is it desirable? Because it doesn't take a genius to work out that people will need a zebra crossing and a job.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and at the front.
I just want to dwell on community consultation as well in relation to the point that the lady made here is, and there's a difference between consultation and democracy. That you, as architects, you must find it very difficult actually, well, just getting your hands on the cash for starters. Money is fragmented across all of Britain in such an extreme scale. Even within a 5-mile radius, you've got a decision-making body. And I'd say Boris is very relevant here because actually Boris criticised Ken for unaccounted expenditure. Well, Boris has got exactly the same problem because he's got the same decision-making structure. Cash is going to unelected individuals who have no mandate to make decisions, and they're making decisions over tiny little areas, which is too small scale to do anything drastic, radically architectural anyway. Very quickly, I remember being in a discussion right next door to the Thames Gateway, and the discussion was what will affect employment in the next few years. It was a long-term strategy. And the Queen Elizabeth Hospital was right on the border as well. Thames Gateway, massive development. Everyone sat there and went, You know, it's like it was not in their 5-mile radius. I mean, that's how ridiculous it is.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, final comments then from the platform, and I'll just go from my right down to the left.
Okay, thanks. I feel we've really only just started this. One of the problems I have is that many people assume that consultation is carried out by those in the know on behalf of those who don't really know, and that's not the case. Very often it's the other way around. Very often we end up working with people who are unbelievable experts in their own fields, and I could tell you many, many stories about those people and the contributions they've made. This kind of process, it seems to me, reflects on where we are today. We are kind of generally all pretty well educated. We are generally quite experienced. We have all travelled. It's very different from 100 years ago. It's a very different set of needs that are placed on the contemporary professional, I think, and we need to recognise that. We need to work with it, and participation is just one of the inevitable ways in which I think we're coming to terms with what those things are. For me, I don't see it as a break or negative. If you get it right, it can build energy, it can build synergies, it can really make things work, and it is not about the lowest common denominator. It's about achieving quite spectacular things if you just listen, if you just take the time and the care to go deep down and find out what's going on. I think that's all I need to say.
Thank you. Richard.
I agree we've just started. What's come through very strongly to me is the points that's been made about democracy and knowledge transfer, and I think perhaps that underpins, perhaps it's an abuse of consultative and engagement processes to regard them as being democratic, and it's a misuse of the dialogue one's having with people which may be more about knowledge transfer. I think the loss of nerve on all parts is also a point that's been very well made, and I've just got one more software analogy to leave you with. I think there's an open source phrase, which is, if you're going to fail, fail big. And I think what we're dealing with at the moment, and this is to say that software programs should just collapse rather than continue to hobble along like some of Microsoft's programs. And I think the problem is we've seen some big failures in terms of some of the visionary cities that have been planned. And I think we're still gathering our nerve back for urban planning 2.0, whatever you want to call it.
Okay, thank you. Tony.
I think I'd just like to say that it's very interesting to listen to some of the commentators because, and I don't think architects have lost their nerve. I think politicians might have done, but I don't think architects have. I think architects are incredibly creative when you look across the span of new generations. The interesting thing about, Corb, dared to fail. Well, I mean, every architect who designs buildings or designs something or sits at a drawing board or a computer screen tomorrow knows that failure sits on one shoulder and success sits on the other. And you've got to do something about it. And it's really about engaging with people to make sure it does succeed. Obviously, Corb failed massively and was paid a pretty big pay packet, I imagine, for failing massively. So let's not forget that. And the people who were subjected to many of his works, or the spin-off from many of his works, got another difficult pay packet as well, and they're still with it. I thought the thing about participation, starting at the first thing, and I hate the word participation, but working with people. And it's difficult for architects. It takes a lot of money. It takes you more time. Corbusier could shortcut it because he has centralized power, just said, give us a city. So he could draw it up very quickly and he would get paid a lot of money for it. It's great. There's nothing for architects like working with an autocrat. You'll make money, you do something quickly, and you might get something sort of built, and it could be quite good. So, you know, failure is a big thing to architects, and that's why we need to develop a culture where architects can stay with their work. And it's really important. It's also, we've derived the sort of local characteristics. I think the local characteristics and the regional characteristics are key to this. Where we go more and more global, it takes us further and further away from people's and real people's issues. So, you know, make sure you tell the architect and the engineer where you want the pedestrian crossing. And if somebody comes along to you and says, where would you like the station, say, within 5 minutes walking time, please.
Okay, thank you. Alistair?
Yeah, just 2 points, I think. I mean, I think this whole sort of we don't know, things are ever so complex and things evolve organically and those that we consult know more than us. I mean, surely not. I mean, we practice, we train for years to be able to gain an understanding of these things, and surely the whole point is that we bring that to bear on the kind of planning and design processes and actually have the confidence to impose our ideas at the end of the day. And the second thing is, just to go back to something that kind of Tony kicked off with, I think, is when we talk about consultation, the idea always arises that it was kind of this radical response to the problems in the 60s, and kind of what you had was civil rights movements and all the rest of it, and the sort of consultation participation movement was part of that. And I kind of think that it's much more useful to see it actually as not a kind of a positively radical movement, but actually what came out of the collapse of modernism and our ability to have visionary ideas and to have progressive ideas and to be able to actually get them built. And the whole sort of consultation and participation movement, I think, is more or less cover for no longer being able to do that and to have the confidence to do that. And the whole idea that you need to be stuck in consulting in local areas and local neighbourhoods because people know their local areas better than you and they cannot sort of see outside more to the world more broadly, actually I think is pretty insulting. People do take on ideas from all aspects of life, and certainly if you think about Chandigarh, I mean, why not bring ideas from planning and urban design in Europe to India? I mean, surely that represents progress to some sort of extent, and okay, some aspects of it might have failed, but nevertheless it was a valid attempt to actually to move things forward. So for me, the thing that we need to grapple with is how actually to reinvigorate a spirit where we can actually have those sort of positive aspirations and start to confront some of the limits that hold us back.
Okay, well, I've made a dreadful job of getting us to finish on time, so we're 5 minutes over. Apologies for that. I mean, just to slightly abuse my position, you know, if the government had a purpose at the moment, if it had a project, I'm sure that I would oppose it. However, I do believe that in a circumstance in which, you know, the government finds it difficult to articulate its own project, then equally it's more difficult for us to begin in any collective sense to put forward our ideas for what we might stand for. And this kind of discussion about, you know, some of the technical aspects of architecture or indeed participation belie that wider social and political problem. So that's my thoughts on the subject, if you like. Can I just ask you to thank all at the same time our sponsors, BDP and Tony in particular, also Blueprint magazine and the Future Cities project, and also the panel for taking the time and bringing their ideas to us today for a most enjoyable discussion. So thank you very much.